Good morning, everybody. Over the last few years at SPR conferences, I've been giving you regular updates on the research that I've been conducting in my role as the Perrott Warwick Senior Scholar. So very kindly, the Perrott Warwick Fund have given me money that allows me to spend a chunk of my time conducting research in parapsychology and supporting colleagues in their research projects. So this year, I'm going to build on that and tell you a little bit, again, give you a bit of context about the rationale, the aims of this project overall, and talk about one particular aspect that concerns a collection of letters that J.B. Priestley gathered that bear on the question of whether people have precognitive experiences in the real world. Another aspect of the project involves more experimental work under more controlled conditions, and you hopefully will hear about that this afternoon when Johnny and Chetak are presenting on a Dream ESP project. So the rationale for the project as a whole is that parapsychology is going through an interesting time. We're getting some quite popular attention, albeit not all of it very positive, particularly revolving around research such as Darrell Bem's, looking at rather sophisticated ways in which we might capture precognition effects in a laboratory using very subtle experimental techniques, or focusing on people's psychophysiology, so how might the body disclose or display information that the person doesn't have conscious awareness of. And again, there seems to be a good body of evidence there that relates to the notion that precognition is possible. The problem for me with that line of research is that although it's very clever, technologically sophisticated, it has relatively little to say to real people about their lived experience. And I think it's important for us regularly to check where we are with the kind of research we do, that the kind of research we design and conduct draws on people's experiences and can say something about them afterwards. There's kind of a circularity to this relationship. And so within that context, I wanted to develop a project which more explicitly is grounded in people's experience and translates those experiences into more formal experimental designs. And what seems to be the best bet, the favourite approach, from just a casual perusal of the kind of case collection literature and particularly surveys, is that altered states of consciousness seem to be a core component of many people's spontaneous experiences. Very typically, if somebody has an unbidden, unexpected paranormal experience, it will tend to be when they are in a slightly altered state of consciousness, drifting off to sleep, waking up from sleep, in dreams, while meditating, and so on. So that seems to be a fertile place to focus within the project. But also within that to look at nuances, so differences across different types of altered state of consciousness. There are traditions or trends in parapsychology to look at hypnagogic and hypnopompic states, so-called, so these are when you're drifting off to sleep and waking up from sleep, which are phenomenologically rather different from being asleep and dreaming, which in turn is different from being wide awake and trying to be psychic. So it's, I think, interesting to maybe try and tease out the differences in the phenomena as well as in the subjective state across those different situations. So you might recall from previous years, you'll have a striking sense of déjà vu, having seen these pictures before, that one of the areas I've been looking is to identify case collections which are relatively under-researched in parapsychological terms. And one of these that I discovered is the Alistair Hardy Religious Experience Research Centre's database, collected by Sir Alistair Hardy. Many of you may remember he was a marine biologist, he was knighted, very eminent in his field, but he had a prevailing interest in a religious experience. So he was the person who came up with the phrase, have you ever had an experience of something greater than oneself that you can't account for in ordinary terms? And really he was trying to tap into people's religious experiences, a sense of something greater than the individual Godhead type. Within that, and in doing that, he gave lots of kind of popular interviews, appeared in popular magazines and on TV, and invited people to submit accounts of experiences in their lives that gave them that sense of something other, that gave them the sense that we were more than just a biological machine. Over time, he collected now nearly 7,000 cases, handwritten letters from about the 1950s, 1960s, and certainly the experiences they refer to relate back to even the 1920s. On occasion, where people earnestly give accounts of their experiences. Now, of course, in these situations, at times, people may be mistaken in the accounts that they give. Maybe, very occasionally, people might be being duplicitous and mischievous, and they're submitting accounts that they know to be false. But on the whole, following the Louisa-Rhine methodology, the sense will be that if you collect lots and lots of cases, then any kind of pattern that emerges, any consistency across cases, is a little bit more trustworthy. That might give us some kind of indication of process or method or mechanism that underlies the experiences, and then anything which is a little bit more frivolous will tend to fall away as noise. So that's the kind of general approach, and across nearly 7,000 cases, there's a lot of material there to get through. So much so that it took us at least twice as long to work through that database compared with our original plan. And I've reported on the data from those previously. So in looking at that work, we wanted to first of all map the incidence and covariance of features. So when people describe, for example, an apparitional experience or a striking premonition, what was going on for them at that time? Are there covariates? Are there other things that maybe are necessary and sufficient conditions for spontaneous sight to occur? And then from that, we would hope to pull out any implications for experimental work. A phrase that I've often used, I've adopted from J.B. Rhine is, if you want to make rabbit soup, you first need to catch a rabbit. Rabbit stew, you first need to catch a rabbit. And the sense of that is, if you want to capture psi in a laboratory setting, you first need the skills to be able to capture the phenomenon, to understand what its ordinary conditions are in the real world, in situ. So that was the focus of that original study. You might remember that that involved reading all 7,000 of those cases in detail, selecting out those that would qualify as relating to parapsychological phenomena in some way, and then performing a content analysis on those cases. So simply scoring each case across a range of criteria for the presence or absence of features, and that then affords analysis later on that sees whether things do tend to co-occur statistically significantly. One of the findings from that study, though, was that people's accounts are incredibly partial and inconsistent, and that there's relatively little reliable data when it comes to those covariates. And it's ended up that much of what we've really done is to note the relative incidences of different kinds of phenomena and maybe pull out in a more qualitative way some of the features of those situations. Certainly among that collection, apparitional experiences were most commonly reported. You might notice that these figures don't necessarily add up to 100% because in any particular letter, people might refer to more than one experience in the same letter. But apparitional experiences were the most common and certainly very often related to evidence of the continued existence of loved ones, very often in a very comforting kind of situation, so during a period of bereavement, for example, those kind of situations, or apparitional experiences that would be called crisis psi by the founders of this society. So the experience of meeting somebody or experiencing somebody at the moment when they're passing or in that window when they're dying. ESP experiences were the next most common category within this collection, ranging from foreboding experiences. And this was quite a surprise. These were much more common than we might have expected, that people described rather visceral experiences. They didn't have mental imagery that they could report. They didn't necessarily immediately identify what the target or subject of this experience was, but there was a sense that things weren't quite right. There was somebody in trouble, there was some problem somewhere. And over time, they were able to identify what that was and maybe act to intervene. And near-death experiences were much less frequent, but were the third most common category. And this was really important, and I think rhetorically as well, in speaking about this to various communities, because it emphasises the importance of people's lived experience, how they understand that experience, and what it is that we're in the business of trying to account for. So what is it people are reporting that we really, as academicians and researchers, need to be addressing? Of course, with this kind of a collection, there's a selection bias. I've talked about this before, particularly in relation to things like out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences. Carlos Alvarado talked about a discrepancy between the frequencies of different kind of phenomena when you compare things like case collections with interviews or surveys. But of course the problem is, when you conduct a case collection, what you're doing is you're inviting people to write in and tell you about their experiences, and people are reticent to do so. So they tend to only do so when they feel emboldened or confident about the experience they've had, and I think naturally that will tend to prefer very dramatic experiences, more evidential experiences. And maybe the kind of trivial paranormal stuff that happens to most of us, that vague sense of déjà vu, a sense of having experienced something before, wouldn't be seen as substantial enough to bother these important researchers with, and so doesn't get reported. But in things like interviews and in surveys, where people are directly asked about the range of experiences they've had, there is an opportunity to mention what might be seen as more trivial stuff. And so I think that's one of the reasons why these cases seem quite dramatic often. So that's where we've got to thus far. That's what I've reported on at previous conferences. There's a second database that I discovered which I think is worthy of much more intensive scrutiny, and this is what I've called the Priestley collection. So many of you might know J.B. Priestley. He's often described, I think rather unfairly, as a rather minor playwright who was very popular, I think, from about 1930s through to the 1960s. In fact, one of his plays, An Inspector Calls, was on my daughter's GCSE syllabus when she was doing GCSE English literature, so I think there's still an interest in the work that he's done, and he was incredibly popular in his time. Time and the Conways, incidentally, appeared on Broadway just last year with Elizabeth McGovern of Downton Abbey fame starring in it, so there is still an appetite and an interest in his plays. I mentioned the plays because Priestley had an enduring interest in man's relationship with time. Many of his plays involve some kind of subversion of the natural linear progression of time as a plot twist, something that can drive the plot forwards. So, for example, in Time and the Conways, Act 1 occurs in 1919, and it's a family gathering to celebrate a birthday. Act 2 is 18 years later, with the same collection of people meeting again to celebrate a birthday, and we see how their lives have progressed. It's quite a depressing play, I think. Many things haven't worked out as people had hoped. And then Act 3 takes you back to 1919 again, at the point when Act 1 ended. But of course, now as an audience, we're privy to many of the things that have happened in the meantime, and also one of the actresses in that final act seems to be quite prescient about how things will unfold. Many of you might know An Inspector Calls. There was quite a popular BBC dramatisation of it a couple of years ago, and the plot hinges, I don't want to give the game away with it, but the plot hinges on the notion that the chief protagonists are asked about various interactions with somebody who is deceased at a time when the person asking them about those experiences shouldn't be able to do what they're doing. So there's a big time twist there. So he had this enduring interest, and subsequent to these plays, he decided to focus more academically on man's relationship to time, and he worked on a project in which he was trying to publish a book called Man and Time, partly influenced by the work of J.W. Dunn, which seems to have been much more influential at the time than I actually had recognised, I have to confess. Many lay people had read the book and been influenced by it, as hopefully we'll see in a few minutes, and Priestley certainly was affected by it. So, for present purposes, all we need to know about Dunn's book is that a core component is that he documents many of his own precognitive experiences. He advocates people keeping a dream diary, so keep a notebook by your bed, and in the mornings note down any dreams that you can remember, and of an evening, just before you go to sleep, refer back to that account and reflect on the day's events to see whether you might see any evidence of correspondences there. That, incidentally, is a way to pick up, actually, on more of the trivial types of events that otherwise would pass unnoticed. So he was interested then in a larger project where he was going to explore man's relationship to time, and there are anthropological and scientific chapters in that book that explore that relationship. But he was also interested in lay people's experiences, particularly where time seemed to not follow its intuitive path, past to present to future, where there are times when that relationship was subverted in some way. And he happened to give an interview as part of a BBC programme called Monitor with presenter Hugh Weldon, where he described this ongoing project. And through the programme, they invited people to post accounts of their experiences. Were there times when you've had an experience where there seemed to be something odd about how time passed by? You seem to know things that you shouldn't ordinarily know at that point in time. And the response was quite overwhelming. Around about 1,500 letters were received. This is a photo from the book with Priestley and his secretary off picture, kind of perusing the latest batch of those letters. And he decided to include a couple of chapters in his book that describe those a little bit. Now, interestingly for us, he's very clear that he's not a scientist, and I think that's quite obvious. He says, I quote, "I offer no careful analysis, no exact figures. If without such treatment they cannot be accepted as evidence, then we shall have to do without evidence. To tell the truth, after they reached 1,000, I stopped counting them, because this kind of activity bores me, and my secretary, after helping me with the first great rush, had other things to do. But I've read them all, with the exception of long screeds from obvious madmen, detailed accounts of books I'd read myself, and letters from people who thought I was in need of a sermon. The letters that tended to fall in those latter categories fell into category F, odds and ends, of his coding. So they set about a coding scheme where they read the letters and they identified whether they had any evidential value. And the forms that they came up with, and clearly their criteria were really quite high. These figures actually come from Katy Price's chapter. They're not my own calculations, because the numbers don't quite add up, and I'm not yet at the stage where I can directly compare figures. There are in total here 949 accounts. The SPR catalogue lists only 938, so I've got 9 to get rid of, something like that. No, 11. So the kind of categories we have here are, firstly, possible examples outside of dreaming of the influence of the future on the present. Trustworthy accounts of precognitive dreams. Precognitive dreams not clearly stated and not sufficiently trustworthy, or premonitions and queer hunches that came right, and various odd little time experiences. Not easy to explain, but equally not easy to prove based on the evidence provided in the letters. Other letters just recommended other people's books, and many offer opinions, so they're speculations about the nature of time from a physical perspective, very commonly, sometimes from a psychological perspective. People clearly are quite well read and are quoting the same kinds of authors and offering their own personal philosophy very often, and then the odds and ends category. So there seems to be a rich source of data here for us to interrogate to see if we can get an understanding of the nature of people's precognitive experiences. And other researchers have taken... Oh no, we're not there yet, okay. This is the exasperating bit. So this looks really like our appetite is whetted, until we see in the book that Priestley goes on to say, I have in fact rejected a large number of letters because the experiences they describe, offered as precognitive time challenges, could be explained, I felt, in terms of telepathic communication. So Priestley was very open to the notion that telepathy was real, but he was uninterested in cases that simply or plainly described telepathic experiences, and they weren't included in his analysis. He was only interested in those that involved some kind of time leaps or precognitive types of experience, or retrocognitive ones, where people maybe have an experience that goes way back in time, but of something that they shouldn't ordinarily have knowledge of. So that was quite exasperating. But nevertheless, I still thought the collection was worthy. So other people have thought this fertile place to go. Just to name check these people at least, to acknowledge the work that they've done. So Jesse Matz was particularly interested more from kind of a critical kind of English kind of perspective, interested in Priestley's writings and how they characterize the nature of time. He summarizes Dunn's position that is adopted by Priestley in these terms, which I think is useful for me in terms of the broader project where we are privileging altered states of consciousness. So he summarizes it thus: only our conscious selves are fixed to the present moment and compelled to follow the moving present inevitably toward death. Our dreaming selves are not, and they are the clue to an entirely different temporal framework. In dreams, a secondary consciousness transcends the present moment and ranges freely among the past, present, and most significantly, the future. Dreams that seem to predict the future actually perceive it, not through any paranormal magic, but because the observer that produces them, normally pegged to our conscious awareness, is free of it. Free in sleep to see the future, which eludes us only because of the limitations of normal awareness. And that's kind of encouraging, given the focus of the project. Katy Price's journal article, I think, has been particularly influential for me, and certainly it was the start of my journey. It was an impressive paper that focused particularly on two aspects of Priestley's collection. One is the way in which women are represented. I think both of them reflect standard skeptical explanations for paranormal experience, and there's been a hint of that even already this morning in Terence's presentation. The idea that very often accounts are dismissed because people are credulous and gullible. Priestley doesn't come out of this too favourably because he propagates the standard sexist notion that women are especially prone to be credulous or irrational, and so therefore, by default, their accounts are less evidential than are men's accounts, men tending towards the rational and the sceptical. That I think is highly dubious, but was his position. But second, and most interesting for me and how I came across the paper, was because of the way in which mental health and mental illness is represented. It's absolutely certain that people having these experiences have real concerns that they are indicative of some form of pathology, and they're very reticent to share those experiences with other people. And certainly there is a trope in this work around the idea of, what will be made of these experiences if shared with particularly mental health professionals, psychiatrists and psychologists. She does include an evaluation of some cases, which I think is really interesting, but it's very much from that focus, so there isn't really an exposition of the material. Again, what I'm arguing for really here is that there's work that can still be done fruitfully with the database, and that's hopefully where I would come in. And then Anthony Peake, hot off the presses, published a book earlier this year, Time and the Rose Garden, which again is a really interesting read, worth taking a look at. It's quite a popular, accessible account of Priestley's life and work and his obsession with our relationship to time. He does also devote a couple of chapters to the time letters, and within that, clearly he's accessed the database. He talks about visiting Cambridge, and he reproduces some of the letters there. A mild criticism, of course, is that this isn't a terribly systematic treatment of the material, and so there's still lots more work that can be done of a content analysis or thematic analysis type to present individual cases that are representative in some way of the work as a whole. So that leads us to the current project, and I've got 5 minutes to tell you about the current project. So the objective here was then to visit the archives where the letters are kept. So the letters have been retained. Priestley kept them and his son donated many of them to the SPR, and we hold them at Cambridge University Library. Others are held at Bradford University Library where there is the J.B. Priestley special collection. They're held as part of it. And again, I wanted to do similar work in cataloguing those cases. Over the last year and a half, I've spent time at Cambridge University Library where our collection is held. Thanks very much to Melvin Willin for organising access to the first database. This is Dr. Simon Sherwood, thanks to him as well, as my colleague who helped me work through this material. Our task in visiting the library was not to analyse the material there and then, but actually, with permission, we were allowed to do this, to take photographs of each and every page of every letter, so that we had an electronic database from which we could work at our leisure. I'll show you why that is a fantastic idea, even if you hold the letters yourself. I would recommend it. And then earlier this year, we visited the Priestley archive at Bradford. So Priestley was originally from Bradford. There's a statue to recognise him that's outside the Science and Technology Museum. That's what that picture is. And we actually had to pass that on our way to the library the few days we were visiting there. Archives always seem to be in basements. So again, we went down to the basement of the library and checked out their letters, again taking photographs of those. So letters look something like this. So we have a single page on each picture. And some of them are typewritten. Quite a few letters are typewritten, but of course many are handwritten, and that's a dying art. Certainly my capacity to read handwriting is dying away, and so having electronic versions has been really useful because you can blow up the writing greatly, and it gives you more of a chance of working out what on earth people are saying. The Bradford collection, when we looked at that more closely, turned out to be mainly of the odds and ends variety. It's very clear that the database, the collection has been cherry-picked, and most of these are coded as F, or lie uncoded, and are general pieces, copies of articles that people have sent, and those kinds of things. So there wasn't much we could do with it, but I'm going through a process now of cataloguing those in a way akin, not maybe as richly as Melvin has done, but in a similar way to the Cambridge database. But the Cambridge database is much more interesting, and it's that collection that we've been working on mostly. All I can do for today is give you a flavour of the kind of work that we've got. Our task is to thematically analyse these. There are fewer cases, so it allows us to do something that's a little bit richer. And with thematic analysis, there are a number of stages to that. The first of those is to code individual studies to capture in some way the essence of those accounts, and then later on to collate those together so that you understand how they might be related to one another. We're very much at the transition between those two phases at the moment. And so all I'm doing here is just giving you a quick look at the kinds of articles, the kinds of accounts people have given. So many of the premonitions that people talk about involve forewarnings. These make evolutionary sense. If we have such a capacity, it would be lent to ensuring our survival and the survival of people who are emotionally or genetically close to us. So these are quite typical. I dreamed that my sister-in-law and I were looking from a window, everything before us was in flames, and my brother in an aeroplane was in the midst of the flames. My sister-in-law kept saying, "However will he get down?" Although my brother was not likely to fly, I felt the dream meant danger and went to tell him of it the next day. They laughed and asked what I had had for supper. Again, this trivial casting off of experiences. On Saturday, they went to Leon Solent fishing. In the morning paper, on Monday, I read, "Leon Solent Pier was destroyed by fire." And the following paragraphs described how Mr. X, who actually was her brother, was trapped with his small son on the end of the pier after part had collapsed, and he had to hold his son and jump 20 feet into the sea to be picked up by a boat. My sister-in-law, who was standing on the land side of the pier beyond the gap, told me afterwards that she kept saying, "However will they get down?" On occasion, people acted on their forewarnings, and this draws concerns about, well, what is the relationship? What are we accessing if we're able to intervene in some way? If we change the future and prevent that disaster from happening, then what on earth will we precognizing? Because the disaster then doesn't actually unfold. And this isn't a case in point. I dreamed I was on top of a bus with my dog, an older type of bus with curved stairway to the platform below. As I was descending the stairway, this is in the dream, this part, yeah? I started to move very suddenly. The bus started to move very suddenly, and I was thrown forward onto the pavement, cracking my skull on the curb. I remember the dream on waking, but as I didn't intend to go out, I didn't think much about it. Later in the morning, I noticed that my dog was distressed, and finding a large inflamed swelling in his ear, I decided to take him to the animal clinic. I was descending the bus stairway when I suddenly remembered the dream and thought, I'm on the bus with the dog, and hung on extra tightly to the rail. When I was almost at the bottom, the bus suddenly moved off sharply. As I had taken such a firm grip, I was swung forward and badly strained my hand, which got twisted around through my maintaining my hold. Had I not had the dream, or had not suddenly remembered it, and held tightly to the rail, then there's no doubt I should have pitched headfirst onto the pavement. So that begs that question about what's the so-called intervention paradox. If we can intervene, then we're clearly not accessing the future. This is one that Anthony Peake reproduces that talks about a change in geography, so I don't think we quite have time for it. But there are a number of waking cases. I think it's likely that I'm going to find more than the 9 that were described by Katy Price. And some of these are particularly interesting, I think. This is one that is also recounted in Peake as well. During the First World War, I was walking alone at night in the Bloomsbury district and found myself looking at the Royal Homeopathic Hospital with tears streaming down my face. This is particularly interesting for me because of this idea of an emotional reaction with no cognitive component. As I couldn't understand the experience, I asked to see a member of the Theosophical Society, the Reverend Robert King, who was known to be highly clairvoyant. He was interested, and after remaining very quiet, he said, "It concerns someone you've not met yet, but with whom you have been associated in many lives. I don't know if this person is a man or woman in this life, but you are bound to meet, and he or she will die in that hospital." I forgot about this entirely, but about 16 or 17 years later, I met a person who became my friend. We lived together for 25 years, and she died in that hospital not quite a year ago. So that kind of sense of closure. And then other waking cases that are similar. Some of them are quite trivial, so I'll finish with this final case. And I think this reflects the influence of Donne, that a number of people mentioned having read Donne's book and acted on it. So they were actively keeping a little dream diary, making notes in the morning as a little experiment, and then reviewing the notes later on in the day after the day's events had occurred. Some of these are very trivial, so one person who said small and important things, one wonders why one bothered to be precognitive about such things. And she talks about a moment of deja vu involving a glass ashtray on a wooden plinth. And then she was at a particularly boring party that evening, and she had a moment where she looked to one side and there was a square glass ashtray on a wooden windowsill, and immediately thought of the dream, that the resonance was clear to her. But it's apropos absolutely nothing. This is a nice case maybe to finish on. In my dream, I was wandering around the garden when I came across a kitten, a curious bright orange. This person was about 18 at this time, and he was in the garden, and he found huddling under a forsythus bush at the end of the lawn a curious bright orange in colour. The incident aroused only a mildest curiosity. This is the dream. I had absolutely no sense of surprise at the discovery at all. So I don't know if I mentioned that. So it found a kitten under the bush. I picked the kitten up, and because it seemed lost, I took it into the house and gave it some milk. That evening, I made a tour of the houses down the street and found its owner. I learned that she had only been given the kitten earlier in the day, and that it had run off before. And then looking at the dream diary, the dream diary account said, fox, squirrel, kitten, some animal, anyway, orange in colour, yellow brush, like our Forsythus. Where do we go from here? Well, we need to go beyond this initial coding and develop what are called superordinate themes. So what do they have in common? What are the core features that they share? And then use those features to see whether we can identify necessary or sufficient conditions for ESP to occur that we can ensure also are present in our lab demonstrations or lab representations of it. I think there's still a need to address this potential bias. These volunteered accounts will tend towards the more dramatic, and there may be areas that we're missing. And the next phase of the Parrot Warwick project that's ongoing is to do survey work. So actually to reach out to people and directly ask them about any experiences, no matter how trivial, that they think might be evidence of ESP in its various forms. Thank you for your attention. Hopefully I can tell you more this time next year.